Well, back to our leading story this morning. Israel has recalled its ambassador to South Africa, Eliav Belotserkovsky, reportedly for consultations following statements from South Africa. Let's now talk to Mary Kluk, who's the Vice President at the South African Jewish Board of Deputies. Mary, a good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us. The initial reaction from the SA Jewish Board of Deputies when the news was released.
Thank you so much for having us. The reaction is one of deep sadness. We're incredibly sad that the demonizing and vilifying of the state of Israel over these past 6 weeks has come to this, and that there is not at the moment a representative of the Jewish, one and only Jewish homeland and Jewish state in South Africa.
Yeah, and I spoke to the former Chief of Staff of DIRCO earlier, just a few moments ago. One of the questions I asked is, what then does interaction between Israel and South Africa look like when South Africa has withdrawn its diplomats from Tel Aviv, and now this is happening vice versa here at home?
Sorry, I heard you say you asked him. I was waiting for you to tell me what he said, but you aren't.
I'm keen to hear what your view is on that particular matter. And one of the things he's talked about is he's essentially said that he's concerned about what interaction then South Africa has with Israel as a result of that decision, or both decisions from both sides. So what is your view of what happens to those relations?
So both governments have made it clear that this is a temporary measure for consultation purposes. I think the notice on the door of the South African embassy in Tel Aviv says that it is until further notice. So the door is not completely closed, and we are very hopeful that the relationships will resume. What that will take for us as a board, we believe that as a first step and an urgent step, the South African government needs to, and the ANC and all South Africans, peace-loving South Africans, need to come out in a loud voice, calling for the release of almost 240 innocent people who were brutally dragged into Gaza and are now being held hostage. Once those hostages are released, we're optimistic that there's an opportunity to begin the process of establishing an end, or establishing peace that will bring an end to this tragic war, where innocent lives on both sides have been so affected. And once there's peace, hopefully that's the beginning of resuming relationships. But I do want to add that South Africa, up until very recently, had aspirations of playing a part in the establishment of peace on the ground, which we all long for in this very complex neighborhood. And I think that this situation and the closing of the embassy, however temporary, in Tel Aviv, and the resultant now withdrawal of the ambassador to Israel does thwart those opportunities for South Africa to be the peacemaker that we have become so profoundly impactful on in terms of peace globally.
I mean, the argument could be made that South Africa, though, is chairing BRICS, and that they're hosting the BRICS nations and new member states that will be joining in 2024 this afternoon. In Gaza, Hamas and Israel top of the agenda, and that South Africa may argue to some extent that they are playing that role. What do you say to that? What are you expecting to come out of that extraordinary BRICS meeting?
Any meeting that can bring about a resolution to this tragic situation, and particularly as a priority to release of the hostages, is a meeting that is really, really important. I think the credibility of South Africa as a peacemaker, given the status of their diplomatic relationships, is questionable. And that's not rocket science. If you have no relationship with one party, it's very difficult to have the trust in the peacemakers, if there's seemingly such a partisan view. And let's not be shy about how the South African ruling party and the government have been, as I said, demonizing Israel in the face of the most tragic day in the history of the state since on the 7th of October.
Yeah. Let's just sit with that BRICS summit that's taking place this afternoon, right? The countries that are going to be taking part in those discussions: Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Iran, the UAE, and then, of course, some of the countries that we already know are part of the BRICS bloc as it sits. One wonders if in that sitting there is going to be, one would call it empathy or perhaps even sympathy for the Israeli side of the discussion, looking at the makeup of those countries.
I think it's interesting. I think that this is not about countries. This is about humanity. And I think that people who really have a deep interest in being a force for peace understand that there needs to be a display of empathy, that it goes beyond platitudes. I don't think that anybody would go to a round table to talk about peace without understanding that as a bare minimum.
Yeah. Your reaction to, and I know this is a story that we've discussed for a few days now, but I'm keen to hear how the Jewish Board of Deputies, after having held a meeting with the African National Congress last week, at this point engages with I suppose the confirmation and information that we got yesterday from the Minister in the Presidency, that referral to the ICC, the South African government is deciding to go ahead with it for individuals in Israel to be prosecuted for war crimes. What is your reaction to that? How do you continue to interact with leaders, our leaders, about that issue?
I think it's, the conversation around the table at the meeting and subsequently is always going to be tough in these circumstances, given the framework you've outlined now. This is not an easy conversation, but I think if we don't have conversations, we're doomed. Yeah. So I think the idea is around dialogue, and the dialogue is tough, and we don't agree on many, many points.
Okay.
But as long as we are in a position to have a dialogue, that's what I believe, and that's what the Board of Deputies is so determined, that we shouldn't ever close the door on a conversation that can, at some point in the future, bring us closer together. Okay. Every moment that we engage is better than if we don't.
Mary, thank you so much for your time. We do appreciate it. Mary Kluk is, of course, Vice President of the South African Jewish Board of Deputies.